Hi, welcome to another episode of the Caroline Glick Show. One of the more disturbing developments in recent years has been the rising up of an apparent access now that Iran enjoys with two superpowers, Russia and China. And although, it seems to be a real access, nobody's really spent that much time talking about it, what its strengths are, what drives these three countries together, what can drive them apart, what separates them, how we're supposed to look at the rising alliance between China and Russia and Iran from an Israeli perspective and from an American perspective. And I think on all things related to Russia and related to China, their interests, how they see the Middle East, and how they see their competition with the United States, my go-to guy has always been David Goldman, my friend and a frequent visitor on this show, the Caroline Glick Show. David is an expert in these areas. He's written about these things prodigiously at the Asia Times, where he also serves as publisher. And so I'm very glad to welcome back to the Caroline Glick Show my friend David Goldman. Thanks for coming back, David.
Oh, thank you, Caroline. It's always a pleasure to talk to you, even about depressing things.
Right. So let's start talking about this depressing thing. When you think about this burgeoning alliance with that Iran is enjoying with China and Russia, where you have China buying around 90% of Iran's oil every year, according to a Reuters story that I looked it up. They said that China is importing around 140,000 barrels of Iranian oil per day, and that the Iranian oil exports, which are all illicit, at least in terms of them being breaches of American sanctions, they comprise 13% overall of China's oil imports. And Russia, on the other hand, has become a purchaser of Iranian drones and other technologies. They built a Shahed drone facility inside of Russia, and they seem to be having a real alliance where not only does Russia provide Iran with things that Iran needs, but Iran also is providing both China with the oil and Russia with technology and with actual drones and other military hardware that it needs in its war with Ukraine. So it looks like not only is Iran a client state, but it's actually also a state that's a major supplier of critical tools of war to Russia on the one hand and energy supplies to China on the other hand. So it all looks quite alarming. And I'd like you to talk a little bit about how this has begun to develop and where it stands today, and we can take it from there.
Caroline, I'm worried. Of course, I'm Jewish, so I worry, but I'm not alarmed for a number of reasons. A couple of weeks
first,
ago...
why are you worried?
Because, as Robert F. Kennedy Jr. put it so eloquently in his press conference last week announcing his support for the candidacy of Donald Trump, we pushed Russia into an alliance with Iran and China. It was not necessary. It could have gone otherwise. In 2008, when the Ukraine crisis was first brewing, I published an analysis saying that we basically had a choice with Russia. If we push them to the wall over Ukraine, their obvious move would be to ally with our enemies, starting with Iran. If, on the other hand, we found some kind of deal with Russia over Ukraine, which would have meant Ukrainian neutrality and protection for the Russian minority in Ukraine, we could have extracted from Russia a concession to help us with Iran, which is a prospective nuclear terrorist state. And the question I ask is, which is more important for American interests? Regime change in Ukraine, regime change in Russia, or the possibility of nuclear terrorism in the Middle East? And my strong view would have been that we should have found a way to deal with Russia over Ukraine and gotten their cooperation over Iran. That was on the table. It no longer is. So there is a three-way alliance, but there are strong limits to it because everyone has intersecting and divergent interests. A Chinese commentary a couple of weeks ago in a website called Observer, which frequently represents state council views, said Iran should not try to fight Israel. It can't fight Israel. The air defense it has is primitive. They're old Russian S-300s, and the Russians are not going to give them the kind of air defense that might be able to deal with the countermeasures carried by, say, an Israeli F-15, let alone a stealth aircraft like F-35. Iran has no land army to speak of, certainly no tanks. Their aircraft are 50 years old and barely functional. So Iran is in no position to fight war with Israel. Iran would lose. It should not try. The Chinese are adamant in their discussion of this publicly and privately that they don't want a war between Iran and Israel, and there's an extremely simple reason for it. Now, Israel, in effect, has said to Xi Jinping, that's a nice little economy you've got there, Mr. Xi. It would be a shame if something were to happen to it. A couple of Israeli rockets hitting the two big Iranian terminals on Karg Island would shut down all of Iran's oil exports. The price of oil would go to $150 or $200 a barrel. Who is the largest importer of oil from the Persian Gulf? Of course, it's China. That would be a devastating blow for the Chinese economy. So if, God forbid, it came to a shooting war between Iran and Israel, China would be a major loser. Russia is certainly working with Iran producing drones. The Shahed drones that it uses to reasonably good effect in Iran and Ukraine probably cost about $10,000 to produce. They might be even cheaper. They're essentially a plywood frame with a moped motor and about $100 worth of electronics. They're very cheap to make. And the Russians use them, of course, very effectively, not because they're hard to shoot down. They're very easy to shoot down, but you could set 100 of them out at a time, swamp Ukrainian air defenses, and open the way for your more powerful ordnance, your ballistic missiles, to get through, which is, of course, what they did this week in 2 waves of strikes against Ukraine's energy infrastructure. But the Russians have been extremely cautious about giving Ukraine any of their better ordnance, the kind that might actually make a difference.
You mean giving Iran?
Iran, yes. Iran wants the S-400 system, which can track aircraft much more effectively and larger number and at greater distance than the S-300. We don't really know exactly how good the stuff is that Iran has, because these Russians have domestic versions and export versions, which are far less effective. So Iran has asked these things. Russia has not given them. One simple reason is that Russia has an urgent need for all of its best air defense systems to fight the Ukraine war. It doesn't have a great deal to spare. But it's also shown a great deal of willingness, as you know, to cooperate with the Israeli Air Force in Syria. Russia does not want to tangle with Israel. And
on the other hand, can I just interrupt you for 1 second? On the other hand, in November, the Iranians announced that they had finalized a deal to purchase advanced fighter craft from Russia. I'm just going over the list. They agreed to buy Su-35s, MiG-28, Mi-28 helicopters, Yak-130 combat trainers. Where does that stand? I mean, that's a major deal.
Years away. Russian production of their top-of-the-line aircraft is limited. They need every airframe they can get in Ukraine. So there's no way that Iran is going to come up on the priority list for Russian deliveries above the Russian army in Ukraine. So there are limits there. Because of their own vulnerabilities and their own constraints, both the Chinese and the Russians, although on paper they're allies of Iran, in practice, they haven't done that much to give Iran the capacity to fight Israel. And I don't believe that either of them wants a war with Israel at this point. Both of them are very vulnerable. The nightmare of the Chinese, which they keep talking about privately and publicly, is destabilization of their Muslim West of Xinjiang province, as well as destabilization of the Belt and Road countries through Muslim fundamentalism. That's what worries. That's their biggest worry, and they keep accusing the Central Intelligence Agency and the Americans of plotting to create a new arc of crisis and do terrible things to them, and so forth. The Chinese press is full of accusations that the United States was somehow behind Islamic fundamentalists in Bangladesh who participated in the overthrow of Sheikh Hasina earlier this month. So there's a limit to how much they want to let the Middle East blow up. That's an inherent vulnerability. Russia is now 20 or 25% Muslim. It's very hard to know to what extent Muslims are gaining on ethnic Russians demographically. There are many projections that Russia will have a 30% Muslim population by mid-century. They've had major terrorist incidents from Muslims, most recently at a prison in the Russian Caucasus. And the Russians are very cautious about the possibility of destabilizing the Middle East. Remember that Putin went into Syria in 2015 because he feared that the Syrian civil war would spill over into Russian territory, into the Muslim-majority Caucasus.
Kind of. I mean, kind of, except he also went in there to get a permanent naval base and to return victoriously to the Middle East after the Soviet Union was ousted from the Levant in 1982 during the Lebanon War by the Israeli Air Force. So, I mean, he got a lot out of his partnership with Assad, and that was really what built his rising partnership with Iran as well, because they were both working together with Hezbollah to preserve Assad in power.
Yes, they wanted to preserve Assad in power because a Sunni-controlled Syria, controlled by Sunni jihadists, would be a threat to his southern flank. I don't know what Putin was thinking. I do know that he told members of the Israeli cabinet that the reason for his intervention in Syria was his fear of spillover of Muslim terrorism into Russia itself. That was certainly a major factor. So Israel has a lot of cards to play here. It's
with Russia, well, with both of them.
With both of them. Russia does not want a fight with Israel in Syria. A fight between the Israeli Air Force and the Russians in Syria could go either way. I don't know enough about the military details to make a prediction, but the Russians, from what I can tell, do not wish to find out, which is why it's still the case that the Russians stand down when the Israeli Air Force attacks Iranian-linked targets in Syria. So despite the overt alliance of Russia and Iran, there's still military cooperation in Syria. It's also the case that when the Russian Defense Minister, Shoigu, went to Tehran earlier this month, Asia Times reported exclusively, but I believe reliably, that Shoigu carried a letter from Putin to the Iranian government offering to mediate between Iran and Israel.
After the assassination attributed to Israel of Hania earlier in the month.
That's correct. This is also a very interesting development. I mean, I doubt anyone will ever know the truth about how Hania got assassinated, but there are a limited number of possibilities. One is that the Mossad has the best deep infiltration operation in Iran that any foreign intelligence service has ever had with any country in history. Another is that elements of the Iranian opposition assisted in the assassination. And a third is that the Iranian government itself, for whatever reason, was not particularly unhappy about getting rid of the guy. So it's interesting how limited the response of Iran and its proxies has been to the assassination. The papers were full of expectations that they'd have a regional Middle East war, massive attacks by Iran against Israel. Iran has done nothing from its own territory, and the attacks by Hezbollah this week were clearly delineated and measured and almost entirely stopped by Iron Dome and Israeli airstrikes and other measures. So it doesn't look like Iran is spoiling for a major war with Israel at this point. It looks like you're taking the advice of the Chinese and being cautious.
I mean, it's possible. It's also possible that they're using this time to advance their weaponization of their warheads and of their nuclear devices that they're developing, and that they have an intention of keeping it quiet until they can announce that they have independent military nuclear capabilities at one level or another. But be that as it may, one of the things that I find exceedingly troubling is the rise of anti-Semitic propaganda that the Chinese are responsible for, both at home in China, which is apparently new, and also abroad throughout the world with TikTok. And you've seen the data on the propagation of anti-Semitic content on TikTok, and it's shocking, and it's hard not to avoid the conclusion that China has decided that it wants to turn away from Israel, and that it is at a minimum waging a major political offensive against Jews, which is more media offensive, or whatever you want to call it, an information war against Jews.
The Chinese are like iron filings on a piece of paper when you put a magnet underneath. They all stand up in the same direction. And when the line came out from Beijing that Israel was a bad entity, suddenly every poster on Weibo and other Chinese social media picked up anti-Semitic memes. It was disgusting to watch and very disappointing. On the other hand, the Chinese are not idiots. And they know that Israel isn't going to go away. And if, God forbid, you got into a real war, Israel reportedly, according to foreign press accounts, has hundreds of nuclear warheads. Israel, without much difficulty, could destroy every city in the Middle East. And they know that. And I don't think they want that to happen. The problem is that Israel is caught in a great power conflict. Israel never wanted to pick a fight with China. Netanyahu made a number of trips there. Trade was going very well, a lot of scientific cooperation, a lot of Chinese investment in Israeli high tech. And then as the new Cold War between China and the United States intensified, Israel, as an American ally, was in the line of fire. So I think the main reason the Chinese are beating up Israel is not because they're inherently anti-Semitic. They never have been, and they have no reason to be. They have no Jews to hate, and to the extent there were Jews there, they got along with them. I think the reason is the simple fact that Israel is an American ally, and China and Israel are at daggers. China and the United States are at daggers drawn. And that's a rotten situation to be in. There's probably no remedy for it in the near term. But the Chinese have a very long view, Caroline. And if you look at the long view, Iran and Turkey, who are the only Muslim countries that have viable high-tech industries and real economic potential, have grave problems. Both of them have are subject to rapid demographic decline. According to the Center United Nations projection, most probable outcome, both of them will lose about half of their working age population in the course of the century. Israel's working age population will double because Turkey's fertility rate is 1.5 children per female, Iran's is 1.6, Israel's is 3. And I know a lot of that is heredity, but the heredity are increasingly going to work. So let's assume that problem can be addressed. What that means, given the relative productivity, is that the economy of Israel by middle of the century will be larger than the economies of Iran and Turkey put together. And by the end of the century, Israel will be by far the dominant power in the Middle East. I went through those projections, just standard United Nations projections at a piece in Asia Times a couple of weeks ago. And a Pakistani commentator said, That's probably why the Saudis and the Emiratis want to link up with Israel. In the long view, Israel is the strong horse. And with the economic power, of course, comes military power. Now, you've commented brilliantly and sharply on Israel's limitations in terms of its order of battle and the quality of its armed forces and the quality of its military leadership. Israel certainly has challenges, but just in terms of raw potential, demographic and economic, Israel is gaining on its Muslim neighbors and will continue to gain unless some drastic change happens. But it's very difficult for me to see how that would happen, say, in Turkey or Iran. Iran is a declining power, demographically and economically and ecologically.
Well, I read your article on that in the Asia Times, and I recommend it to all of our viewers to read it themselves. It's an important piece, but it's a long-term view. And one of the things that you mentioned here that I think is the key is that because Israel is an American ally, China and Russia are sort of striking out more aggressively against Israel than we've seen them do in the past. Because as the tensions between China and Russia with the United States increase, Israel is sort of the victim of that increase in tension. So there are a couple of things to look at here from an Israeli perspective, and one of them is, is there a way for Israel to improve our relations with these two powers, to undermine their loyalty or whatever you want to call it to Iran, the help that they're providing Iran at any level?
Well, in the case of
without alienating the United States.
This is obviously a tough one. This is, fighting the war as if there's no white paper and fighting the white paper as if there's no war. In the case of Russia, let's hope, at least I devoutly hope.
And by the way, that was a failed policy. We lost 6 million Jews, and the white paper went on uninterrupted until the establishment of Israel in 1948.
Yes, well, sadly, yes, though our options then were a lot more limited than they are now. Let's hope that Donald Trump is elected president. And as RFK Jr. said, the reason he was joining the Trump campaign, his biggest single reason, is because Trump promised on the first day in office to call up Putin and find a way to settle the Ukraine war. That would immediately give Israel room to talk to Russia if that shooting war between the West and Russia were ended. In the case of China, things are more complicated because the United States is not reconciled to China's rise as a major power and the possibility that China might become a peer of the United States, or even in some respects, a more powerful country. We can't wrap our minds around that. We can't accept it. We don't like it. I personally don't like it. So dealing with China is difficult. What does China want from Israel? Technology, most of all. And the United States has done a pretty effective job of squelching Chinese investment in Israeli high-tech companies. Now, is there a way to get around that? Not really in the short term. But I think it's important to remember that China and Israel have long-term strategic interests in common in dealing with Muslim fundamentalism and terrorism. China should be worried about Qatar and the Muslim Brotherhood more than anyone else. I mean, the Chinese complain about because that would be the main source of terrorism and destabilization that might be aimed at China itself, internally, or in the Belt and Road countries where China is making massive investments. China has a gigantic commitment to Central Asia. The whole concept of the Belt and Road is to unify the Eurasian continent through transportation, digital communications, and other investments. So take the case of Bangladesh. I know that's very remote from Israel, but it's a country of 170 million people. It just had a coup. There are many people in India who allege, and we've carried commentary on this in Asia Times, that it was the Jamaat-e-Islami, the Muslim Brotherhood branch of Bangladesh and India, which ran the street riots, which ultimately forced out Sheikh Hasina and put
Well,
in
we certainly
a new
saw a
government.
lot of footage. Let me just ask you. Let me just add to that. We certainly saw a lot of footage in the days following the overthrow of the president of Bangladesh, of groups of Muslims going after Bangladesh's Hindus, particularly the women, but of mass killing of Hindus that were very reminiscent of the footage that we had here in Israel on October 7th. So there does seem to be a lot of that going around.
And there are many Indians who will tell you that the coup was designed to put pressure on India. Sheikh Hasina herself said that if she had agreed to give the United States a military base that they had asked for, she wouldn't have been overthrown. So that's her accusation as well. I'm not in position to judge these events. However, there are credible people in India and elsewhere making those allegations. So from China's standpoint, if you look at their whole southern flank, you have Muslim-majority countries like Indonesia and Malaysia, which are critical for their trading relationship. You have a Muslim minority in the Philippines and in Thailand. And then you have Central Asia, which is their western flank and the bedrock of the Belt and Road Initiative, all of which are vulnerable to destabilization. So from China's standpoint, the first thing they did after the problems they've had in Xinjiang was to pay off the Turks. The Uyghurs, of course, are a Turkish people. They speak a dialect of Turkish. And the Turks, for years, Erdogan for years denounced the Chinese for genocide in Xinjiang, and he's been, now he kind of likes what's happening in Xinjiang because he's getting a lot of money from the Chinese. But paying people off may not be enough. It may be necessary to suppress this terrorism, and the same enemies that Israel has in the region, basically varieties of the Muslim Brotherhood, are also a major worry of the Chinese. So although on the surface, Israel is a friend of the United States, China is an adversary of the United States, and that's the division. This is a complex world, and the Middle East is a complex place. There are commonalities of interest. And I've heard this discussed for a dozen years in many trips to China by Chinese military and security people, Chinese policy people. The first thing that any Chinese foreign policy expert or official will tell you in a conversation is, you're American? We're worried that the Americans are trying to destabilize us through Xinjiang using Muslim fundamentalism. Their number one concern. And that's the number one enemy of Israel. Now, exactly how this might work out in practice, given the constraints that you mentioned that we all know, is beyond me. And if you ask me how Israel should proceed, I would say very carefully. And probably not, whatever happens probably should not be explained to journalists like me, because then we'll write about it.
Because the thing is that Qatar, Qatar, as you said, it's the capital of the Muslim Brotherhood. It's the closest Arab ally to Iran. And yet, despite their incredibly destabilizing position, they've managed to position themselves as some sort of a moderate country. We've seen this obviously with the United States, but it's true as well with China. So where do you see that going, those relations?
Well, that's a tough one. I don't know. I blame Qatar for October 7th, at least to some important extent, because Qatar was sending the, $30 million a month, whatever it was, to Hamas, and assuring the government of Israel that they had Hamas paid off and Hamas was going to be quiet. So they played a significant role in arming and funding Hamas and probably in the deception. So I think they're a very evil bunch of people. On the other hand, they spread vast amounts of money around in Washington. And Washington is a swamp with a deep state, which is corrupt. So Qatari influence is enormous. Hopefully, a change in administration might present an opportunity to deal with that. But I think the fact that they have this gas bubble and trillions of dollars worth of hydrocarbons, and that they're crazy, makes them extremely dangerous. And the sane countries of the region, such as the Gulf monarchies, should try to find a way to deal with them. The Gulf monarchies, as Saudi Arabia did try to shut down Qatar, and they failed because Turkey supported them.
Well, they failed because the Turks came in, but also because even the Trump administration wouldn't take it up. I mean, the Trump
right.
administration also, it sort of had a leg in both camps until they finally just said, we'll make up. And it's a big problem. I mean, that was the position of the Trump administration, and it makes it very difficult as a practical matter for anybody to do anything about Qatar. Plus, everybody gets money from them by the same token. But all right, so when you look at the Russian and Chinese relations with Iran, you're saying that yes, it's worrisome, but no, it's not alarming because they're not that strong. They're not as strong as they look. What is it from the United States' perspective, though? I mean, the United States, one of the things, I guess the first question I want to do to break this down is, you were writing about what you perceived, I think rightly, as America egging Russia into a position that it wouldn't have necessarily chosen on its own, which is adversarial towards the United States and embracing America's enemies, including China, because the United States really left it with no choice because the Democrats decided to present Russia as the evil one, as the worst force on earth, because it was much more manageable and less dangerous really than China was. And so they didn't want to deal with China, so they exaggerated the threat from Russia. At least that's how some people would characterize the situation. But you do things, I think you made this point in a couple of conversations we had around the time of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, which is that you can only break so many eggs. I mean, how much can the United States be provoking Russia and expressing deep enmity towards Russia without convincing the Russians that the United States is an implacable foe and that there's no deal to be made with them, regardless if it's in the White House. In other words, assuming that RFK's argument is correct, and obviously Putin himself is he's no Boy Scout, to put it mildly. It's not just that he's responding to American action, he's also an actor in his own right and a very powerful one. And he's pursuing interests as he sees them. Some of them are nefarious from an outside perspective or a Western perspective, all the same. Now, the real question is, say Trump is elected, which of course we all are hoping for, and that he comes back into office in January. How much credibility at this point does the United States have with Russia that would enable it to walk back the hostility in a way that is advantageous to the United States as well as Russia, as opposed to lopsided bargain or perceived as a lopsided bargain by too many stakeholders in the United States to make it a desirable deal or desirable enough for the Russians for them not to feel like they would be losing faith in having some sort of a reconciliation with Washington. In other words, just to put it very short, is it too late? I mean, and if not, why not?
Putin is not Hitler. He's Lucky Luciano. He's the capo di tutti capi. He has interests and he'll make deals. Well, I'm not saying Putin is a good guy. Putin is a nasty piece of work. On the other hand, by the standards of Russian history, he's something of a moderate. No one in Russia talks about Ivan the Reasonable. Compared to Alexander Dugin and the ultranationalist, Putin is a fairly rational character. Putin has constraints. why hasn't Putin? Putin has 5 times the population of Ukraine. He's got roughly the same number of soldiers in the field as Ukraine. Why hasn't he done a massive national mobilization and overrun Ukraine? Because that would not be a popular thing to do, and he would be risking his political scalp by doing so. So he's been willing to keep this on a fairly low burner with a relatively small number of men in the field, relying on aerial bombardment and so forth to try to slowly degrade the Ukrainian military. But that kind of military posture does not bespeak a conqueror who wants to take over everything. That's somebody who's going to ultimately look for a deal because he's not willing to go all in. Now, what kind of deal would Putin take? That would be, as you say, face-saving. Well, the two existential issues for Putin are, one, protecting Russians in Ukraine, and that would probably mean the annexation of a few oblasts in Luhansk and Donetsk, keeping Crimea, and some agreement that Ukraine stays out of NATO. And if that happens, Putin will declare victory and not quite go home, but at least stay home in the part of Ukraine that he wants. I mean, to occupy all of Ukraine, let alone attack Germany or Poland, would require 1 million men. Occupations are very labor-intensive, and Putin is in no position to do that. So I think, yes, Putin is willing to deal. And the person to watch in this respect is Viktor Orban, who has been acting, at least de facto, as an intermediary, in touch with Donald Trump, in touch with Putin, in touch with the Chinese, in touch with the Ukrainians. And Orban, from his recent public statements, is quite confident that a rational peace deal can be put together. So yes, I think that's definitely a possibility. Russia is that does not mean that we will wean Russia away from an alliance with China. The Russians are never going to trust the West enough again to give up their economic relationship with China. Remember, every leader of the West, everyone in Washington, everyone in Brussels at the European Commission, was convinced that sanctions of various kinds would shut down the Russian economy and bring about regime change in Russia. Biden himself tweeted that the Russian economy would shrink by half, and said it's actually expanded during the war. And that's because not just China, but India, Turkey, the former Russian republics, and many other countries took the opportunity to expand their trade with Russia. And Russia will not give up those trading relationships. So we're not going to bring Russia back into a happy family of the West. There are people who've got the illusion that we can split Russia from China and make Russia an ally against China. I think that's a fantasy. What we can do is stop the killing and make possible a number of other diplomatic deals. The other thing to keep in mind, Caroline, about the Middle East is there is a new major player on the scene. We were talking about Qatar and Saudi Arabia and Iran a few years ago. The big difference, and perhaps a turning point, came a year and a half ago, January of 2023, when China mediated the restoration of diplomatic relations between Iran and Saudi Arabia. That was completely new. Now, the Chinese talk a lot about mediating. They've offered to mediate Ukraine. They have no serious intent of doing so. They've offered, and they really didn't get anything out of that. They got some agreements on paper. Let the Chinese try to do their own version of Camp David, where Yasser Arafat told Bill Clinton to go to hell. The Chinese are not stupid enough to commit their reputation to a mediation effort, which is likely to lead to nothing and make them look stupid. So I think that's a public relations ploy on the part of the Chinese. They have no serious intent of mediating that, but they did mediate the Saudi-Iranian issue. And that's quite an important thing. The Chinese inherently The Chinese are not a revisionist power in the Middle East. They've never been there. They have nothing to revise. Their main interest is economic. They have one base in the Middle East at Djibouti, which has, last I checked, 200 Marines. If they put together another base anywhere, it might be in Cambodia, but I think another military base in the Middle East is out of the question. So they don't want military involvement. They want economic and technological control. And for that reason, they do not want to push things to a war. They want to exploit the stupid anti-colonial reflex against Israel and the global South for propaganda purposes. They want to represent themselves as the friend of and champion of the Muslim world, although they've probably done more to repress Islam than any other country in the history of the world. They want to have it both ways. But if you want to have it both ways, that constrains the amount of damage you can do.
Well, one of the ways that they could damage, I guess, I mean, when we look at the situation, and I think you'll agree with this war is really only going to be won in a real way. I mean, forget, the issue of land and who controls it, but in terms of actually ending the hostilities as a strategic, I don't know exactly even what to call it, as a regional threat to Israel, as opposed to secret threats of specific terrorist organizations operating in neighboring lands, is to overthrow the Iranian regime. That would also undermine, to a very large degree, the prospect or end the prospect of Iran as a hostile power emerging with nuclear weapons to use against Israel, and either directly or as an umbrella for massive aggression against Israel by Iran's proxies. So however you look at it, from an Israeli perspective, the most desired end state is a post-Ayatollah Iranian regime of whatever kind. And when you talk about China's opposition to an Iranian strike against Israel because it would undermine their oil supplies from Iran, undermine their economy, I mean, if there was a push by the United States, by Israel, by the Iranian people, what have you, all together in one way or another to overthrow the regime, and I mean, would that be something? How would China respond to that? Did you track at all how they were responding to the anti-regime uprising after the execution of Mahsa Amini? What was that in 2021?
They didn't give it a lot of attention. The Chinese get very nervous when any regime in the area gets overthrown. Their default position is, if a regime is overthrown, it's probably a CIA-inspired color revolution designed to hurt us. Even paranoids have enemies, but the Chinese are a bit paranoid about it. So of course they wouldn't like it. The Chinese want to keep things as they are, and they have enormous influence in China. They take in Iran. They take all of Iran's oil virtually, and they dominate exports to Iran, although China's exports to Iran are still a fraction of their exports to Israel. It's not a big economic benefit for them. So they would not like it. However, it's impossible to imagine that any Iranian regime would not want to maintain economic relations with China. China is the natural market for their oil and the natural provider of the kind of goods that they typically would need. So life would go on. Nothing would please me more than the overthrow of the clearocracy in Iran. Would try to be happy about it? Of course not. Anything the United States does.
Would they try to block it? Would they use their technological and other power to undermine efforts to overthrow the regime? If you had to guess,
well,
would they protect the regime?
The Chinese have very good monitoring technology. For example, facial recognition. No, you walk into a Chinese airport, and you walk through a lot of the controls because they've got your face and they recognize you, and it's all very efficient. They've really pioneered that technology. And of course, in terms of electronic eavesdropping, they're extremely good at these things. So yes, certainly
Nobody does it better.
the technology that they provide to the Iranian regime, in theory, could help Iran security services suppress opposition. Would the Chinese sell it to them? Of course. Sell it to anybody. Would they weep over the fall of the mullahs were that to happen? Not particularly, but China would be opposed to any American/Israeli Western effort at regime change in Iran. No question.
I saw, I was having a conversation with somebody who spends a significant amount of time in China a few months back, and I had it explained to me that essentially what we're seeing now with Xi is a Stalinization of the Chinese regime, that they're becoming much less open to foreigners. They're discouraging of foreign education, foreign travel by their people. They're much more stringent in their controls over contacts with foreigners. And Xi, they're developing, or if they haven't already developed, cult of the personality of Xi in a way that we haven't seen since Mao in China. And under those increasingly repressive conditions, wouldn't that sort of bespeak a more radical foreign policy as well on the part of the Chinese vis-a-vis the Middle East? And I guess we can round this out by discussing as well the specific threats that they pose to the United States.
I think this is overstated. Certainly, there are many fewer Chinese students applying to American universities, but a lot of the reason for that is it's harder for them to get visas, and many of them have experienced severe scrutiny since we decided that America was riddled with Chinese spies under the Trump administration. Another factor is that Chinese universities have come up the curve, and you get in engineering, you get as good an education at the top 20 Chinese universities as you do at MIT or Caltech. And it's it's free. So there's less incentive to move overseas. I think Xi has one great task in his view. Deng Xiaoping, starting in 1979, took a nation of peasants, 90%, almost 90% rural, and turned it into a nation of factory workers. Xi is trying to turn China into a nation of engineers and make China a high-tech country. To give you an idea of the difference, when Deng Xiaoping started his reforms in 1979, 3% of Chinese went on to tertiary education. Now I believe it's 63%, about the same level as Germany. So even though China's workforce is slowly falling, its population of highly skilled workers and engineers is rapidly rising. And that's an enormous transition. And the first thing he needed to do was to move investment out of the land industry, the real estate sector, into high tech. And he did that by crushing the real estate sector. That also meant breaking the rice bowl of every local political machine in China, which all lived off the real estate market. That's essentially the anti-corruption campaign. He did it from the top, and he did it in a rough way. Does China want a war with the United States? Well, depends over what. If the United States were to announce that it had an agreement with Taiwan for Taiwanese sovereignty, China would go to war with the United States, without any doubt. If the United States wants to maintain the status quo with Taiwan, which is that its status is yet to be determined by mutual agreement between Taiwan and China, and the United States, as we've reiterated many times, does not support Taiwanese formal independence, I think the Chinese regime will kick the can down the road. It's also hard to imagine how a war would look. We're thousands of miles apart from China. China has spent almost nothing on expeditionary forces, and I keep having this fight with Bridge Colby about this. China has 30,000 Marines. We have 200,000. They have 10,000 special forces. We have 75,000. They simply don't have the ability to project power or the people to do it with. But they do have thousands of surface-to-ship missiles, satellites to guide them, 60 modern submarines, hundreds of fourth and fifth generation aircraft. They have a coast that is bristling with ordnance that can project out to about 1,000 miles. No expeditionary force that you could imagine that we could conceivably build can carry enough ordnance, enough missiles, to fight a land-based missile force, which doesn't have to worry about putting them in ships. We're simply massively outgunned. So we can't, in my view, we can't fight a war on China's coast. And China doesn't have any military assets anywhere else to fight. I guess we could invade Djibouti and kick the 200 Marines out, but it's hard to imagine how we would fight a war. It's so asymmetric. The danger is you get into a kinetic incident in the South China Sea and China ends up sinking a carrier. Admiral Stavridis a few years ago wrote a scenario thriller called 2034 about exactly that. So that's certainly a risk. But if we fought a war in the South China Sea now, we would lose it. And we'd probably go nuclear.
I think that the more realistic way of looking at a military contest between the United States and China is that China sort of checkmates the United States in space. It checkmates the United States in missiles. It checkmates the United States in power projection in the Pacific so that they could, essentially, the argument is that they could dislodge the Navy and the United States more generally from their positions in the Pacific, even threatening Japan and places like Okinawa. So, I mean, you're looking at that, and when you look at the threat environment that Israel faces, there's some reminiscent aspect to it, which is just that you could say that Hezbollah, that they now field a significant ground force, the Radwan brigades, their main strategic threat that they pose to Israel is through their missiles. That's a truth with the Houthis as well. They've been undermining global shipping in the Red Sea because of their cruise ballistic missiles, so that you're able to undermine or fight an asymmetric war relative to great purpose, to great effect, even if you don't have conventional forces. So I think that that's more the idea that China would dislodge the United States from its position as primary global superpower, undermine its alliances with its Pacific allies by just outgunning it in terms of missiles, in terms of the ability to project force, in terms of the willingness to project force to protect the Chinese aspirations or to advance in the Pacific over the United States. And obviously a scenario of downing an American aircraft carrier would be another demonstration of the overwhelming might that China fields in that area.
There are always risks to that. If you push the Japanese too hard, they may go nuclear. And that's the last thing the Chinese want. The last time the Chinese tangled with the Japanese, they didn't like it. Japan could probably develop a nuclear weapon in months, if not weeks. And the fact that they haven't means they don't feel threatened enough that China threatens them too much. In the case of the Philippines, why occupy the Philippines when you can buy it? You can simply intimidate it and buy it. Now, China's exports to the global south have doubled in the past 4 years. China sees its economic future in the global south. That's where the preponderance of young people will be in the world. So their economic relationships with Indonesia, Thailand, Malaysia, Philippines, and India, in fact, have grown enormously. I think China's main objective is to gain a lock economically and technologically on the global south, and make their homeland impregnable. I don't see China occupying the Philippines or Vietnam. Why should they? They're getting everything they want without firing a shot. But they do want to. Yes, go ahead. Sorry.
No, I was just going to say, so we wanted to sort of encapsulate what we've been discussing today. I mean, then there is one other aspect, which is the currency war with the United States, where Iran and many other countries are increasingly carrying out their trades without dollars, so that you're doing it with the yuan as now the currency of trade with the Saudis, and I know that the Biden administration was trying to curtail that with some sort of a strategic alliance or defense treaty that they were negotiating with the Saudis. But the fact is that the dollar as a global trading currency has been significantly downgraded over the past 3 years of the Biden administration. And that also poses a major threat to the United States because of this alliance. I mean, this alliance was sort of the spearhead of that undermining because of U.S. sanctions on Iran and China, if I'm not mistaken. And now India is a major participant in it as well.
This is basically barter trade. You have goods and they're denominated in one currency and you sell them for that currency, but you can't do much with the currency. The Russians are swimming in the Indian rupees, selling oil to India. They've got nothing to do with them. They don't want them.
Is that why India is buying so many Russian arms then?
Well, the Russians are insisting they buy more stuff to pay for the oil. If you want to finance trade over the long term, over several years, you have a balance of trade deficit, you go into the world market and you borrow in the major lending currency. That's dollars, euros. You could borrow a certain amount of yuan, certain amount of RMB. That's called dim sum bonds, for example. But that's a very limited market, and the reason is the RMB is not convertible. You cannot take money out of China unless you get special permission to do so. So if you're paid in RMB, what do you do with it? What can you buy with it? You can only buy things in China, and you may not want to. So as long as the Chinese decline to make the RMB inconvertible, and I think that will last for many years because they don't want to open up a free market in foreign exchange. They want to keep it under control. It's very difficult to replace the dollar as a reserve currency, except at the margin. So the non-dollar trading arrangements you see are cumbersome, expensive, and a pain in the neck, but people do them to get around sanctions. That makes it worth the while to do it. That's not going to replace the dollar until such time as you have free convertibility of RMB, and there's nothing else that could challenge the dollar except the RMB. So I'm not worried about that as a short-term 5-year horizon kind of thing.
Interesting. So if we were to summarize a little bit about what we've been talking about the a rise of the axis of the Chinese with the Russians and the Iranians, if you wanted to just summarize, aside from what you said, that you're worried but not alarmed by it, you think that their national interests may outweigh their group interests, or the group interests cannot satisfy their national interests?
It's less an axis than a reactive set of deals under duress because of the Ukraine war and the U.S.-China confrontation. There are many divergent interests among these different elements of it, and the basic thing I disagree with is the idea that Israel is the outpost of the West in the Middle East against a new authoritarian axis of like Hitler, Mussolini, Japan, and World War II, and we're defending the West, and that's how we should think of Israel. Israel is a Middle Eastern country with divergent and convergent interests with every other country in the world. We have more convergent interests with the United States than anyone else, but our interests are not identical with those of the United States or any other country. And Israel should look for opportunities to exploit divisions and disagreements and openings among these countries where it's possible, as it indeed does, for example, with the military cooperation with Russia in Syria. So I think those divergences may increase over time, particularly if the Ukraine war is settled, and Israel, as an independent power pursuing its own interests, needs to look for opportunities to improve its strategic position wherever they come from.
Oh, I couldn't agree more with that. And actually, it has been an encouraging conversation with you, because I think, the headlines are scary. The agreements that they're signing, that Iran signed with China, that China was going to invest in an enormous amount of money. I can't remember what it was anymore, over a 25-year period with Iran, and very little of that money apparently has been invested to date. So they promised that they're going to do it, or they promised that it would happen, but they didn't promise that it would happen in our lifetimes, I guess. Is
one of those,
way to
in
look
fact,
at
one
it.
of those deals was canceled after the United States left the JCPOA. So, Iranian-Chinese trade is very small. China exports to Iran a fraction, maybe a fifth of what they did 10 years ago. So
Interesting.
it's important, but it's limited. The Chinese have no allies. They are pure mafia. They've got their territory, other people have territory, and they work out deals about who has which kind of territory. They're communists the same way the mafia is Catholic. They're entirely pragmatic. They're not ideological. They're no less nasty for being pragmatically nasty. But the Chinese always look for a deal and always look for a negotiated solution as opposed to a violent outcome if they can get it. That's their default position. So the main thing Israel should do with China is talk to China, understand its thinking, look for opportunities. Right now, relations are horrible. As you pointed out, the Chinese are spreading anti-Semitic propaganda. And there's that's very good reason for Israel to be very angry at China. But anger is justified, but you don't act out of anger. You act out of calculating self-interest. And we do have common enemies with China. That's Muslim fundamentalism.
And you think that China understands that?
I know China understands that. That's been a subject of conversation between Israeli security people and China for a dozen years. I've heard some of those conversations.
All right. Well, we're going to have to continue this conversation another day, but I think I learned a lot from it, and I hope that you all learned a lot from it as well. And I'll be back as well for another In Focus this week. I want to thank you, David Goldman, again for coming back to the show. It was very important, I think, to take a step back and look at this relationship, this trilateral relationship we're seeing, which has been yet another source of worry in Israel, as if we didn't have enough on our plate.
This is the only time we get to talk. It's always a pleasure to talk to you, Caroline. Thank you.
Thank you. Have a great day, and we'll see you again soon again. Thanks so much.